Welcome to Ask the Lynnwood Cop. I'm Teresa Whipple. Deputy Chief Jim Nelson, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Teresa. Glad to be here.
We are going to talk today about a term that we hear and members of the public hear about, but police have some descriptions for it that I thought would be helpful to share, and that is de-escalation. Can you tell me what that means and how you address that in situations that you're involved with?
Sure. De-escalation means to really for us to try to diffuse a situation. How do we first make a situation safe for everybody that's there, including the police, and then once we get the scene safe, how can we go forward with trying to resolve whatever the issue is we're facing at that time?
Okay. So this is usually a crisis situation where there's some kind of a major issue that you're dealing with.
Sure. I think a lot of people think of crisis, they think of, kind of the extreme. But for us, we deal with people in some type of crisis regularly.
Sure.
Really almost every call where there's some type of conflict, there's some level of crisis occurring. So it can range from people being upset at each other over a car accident or just upset at the situation itself, all the way up to, somebody who's armed themselves and potentially posing a threat to other people.
Okay. So when you talk about de-escalation, what does that, when you go into a situation, what does that mean? We talked a little bit about how sometimes when you are in that type of issue, you don't necessarily know what the person's background is, whether they have mental health issues, exactly what you're dealing with. So how do you approach that?
Well, absolutely, and that's really the key is when people know who they are, but when we show up, we unfortunately aren't able to see what everybody's intent is or what they're, what's going through their head or what they're experiencing. So when we approach a scene, there's a lot of assessment that goes on as you're approaching it, from body language to verbal cues to obviously if there's obvious threats like a weapon or something that's at play in that particular incident. So when we approach that scene, we're making those assessments, but then we're also the most important thing we can do is we can start communicating,
right,
and help us determine what the next steps are. It is a bit of trial and error at a lot of scenes. When you approach somebody and you start talking to them, you gain clues from them on their reaction to the conversation about what's the best way to get this situation first safe, and then how can we work towards resolving the problem.
And I would imagine that if somebody who is watching this maybe comes across police in a situation like that, where maybe they are not the person who is in crisis, but maybe they are a family member or a neighbor or a bystander, if they were aware of maybe some of the background, it would help you to be able to know that, right? That's how the public could help the police? Absolutely.
So the first way that information comes in a lot of times is through dispatch. So if police are being called and you're aware that the person is in some type of mental health crisis or what their level of agitation is, if it's a specific mental health disorder, if you can identify what that is and even say a lot of times if we're dealing with situations where people know each other well, they can kind of know what sets a person off and also what calms them down. That information is great for dispatch to get so the officer can get that information on their way to the scene. Or when the officer gets to the scene, if you're able to communicate that information quickly. Keeping in mind that when we show up, we're scanning everything. So sometimes those heat of the moment conversations, you're not going to get officer turn and stop and talk to you specifically, so you may just need to kind of call it to them as the officer's assessing the scene and try to let them know. The most important thing is to try to do it as calm as possible, because lots of times there's raised voices, and when people are agitated, we see people at their worst, and so sometimes the communication is the biggest breakdown when those situations occur.
Okay. And along those lines, you had mentioned to me that police do receive specific training for this type of thing. Talk a little bit about that.
The training really starts at the academy.
Yeah.
And de-escalation has been a topic of law enforcement as long as I've been in law enforcement, about 23 years. When I went to the academy, we covered topics on de-escalation, how to talk to people, how to try to diffuse situations. There's been more effort recently for the past several years. Our officers, we've been sending officers to a 40-hour class, which is a pretty big time commitment for training on a class called Crisis CIT, or Crisis Intervention Techniques. And that class really focuses on that communication. There's a lot of mental health emphasis on that, but the techniques used to de-escalate those situations are really applicable to all types of situations.
Anything else that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
Well, no, I think it's important for people to understand. There's the concept of when police show up, that kind of we kind of try to do our own self-inventory on our way there, and when we get there, what are we experiencing, so that we understand our emotions, and as we try to de-escalate the situation, yelling or getting people out of that, trying to get out of that protection. People want to protect themselves, so that's the first thing they're looking at. So once we can bridge that gap, then we can maybe get to the resolution of the problem, or at least trying to determine what the next best course of action. But the most important part is to get that conversation started, that dialogue, whatever it looks like.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be back again soon with another episode of Ask the Lynnwood Cop.